Welcome, everyone, to the virtual caregiver retreat for families and caregivers of children with FASD and children who are spirited and intense. My name is Hildred Dawson, and I am the team lead at Health Nexus. At Health Nexus, we work to support communities and families with FASD through several projects listed at www.fasdinfo.tsaf.ca. And we support parents and parents to be through many resources listed at www.beststart.org. Before we go any further, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. We will begin this virtual caregiver retreat session 4 by acknowledging that we are on Indigenous land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to be here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Long before today, there have been Indigenous peoples who have been the stewards of this place. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We recognize the contributions of Métis, Inuit, and First Nations have made, both in shaping and strengthening our province and the country as a whole. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also clearly and overtly connect to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities and in our lives. We will now go on to the webinar. We will have time for questions at the end or in between. So please just type your question and answers in the box. Rebecca will be the moderator and will read the questions, and Pascal, our presenter, will do the answers mostly. Maybe some of them will be answered by Rebecca. If you need any technical assistance, you can also use the chat. We have a lovely production crew at our fingertips who've been helping us through the virtual caregiver retreat. And with that, I would like you all to join me for session 4, Family Wellness, Keeping Everyone Self, presented by Pascal Gagnier. Pascal is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies at the University of Ottawa. He recently joined Health Nexus as a health promotion consultant. Prior to this position, Pascal has been the FASD research lead at ABLE2 in Ottawa. He also teaches classes at various universities and colleges. Rebecca Lowering Spencer from Adopt for Life will join Pascal as moderator during this session. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Rebecca and Pascal.
Thank you, everyone. Rebecca, do you want to share a few words about yourself, just to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am situated in Toronto currently and have worked for Adopt for Life for the last few years, and we are pleased to be alongside your work here this evening.
Thank you. So Rebecca has lots of experience, and she's going to jump in at any time today. And hopefully we're going to have a conversation about a very difficult and sensitive issue. As you may know, this is a safe space for caregivers tonight. And it was important for us to be there to respond to your questions and inquiries and be able to support you as well. And hopefully, provide you with the support that you need. So we're conscious that a few of them may be curious about, the issue of safety in the home. Some of you may have experienced that in your home as well. And we really want to acknowledge that and honor that. And thank you for being here tonight. And hopefully this will provide you with better tools to respond to situations that you're facing, and also finding some sort of hope and some strategies that will enable you to be more resilient and nurture that resilience in your everyday life. So we just want to say that this is a session for you tonight, and hopefully you let us know what you want to know so that we're able to jump in and hopefully be relevant to your experience. So we want to talk today about FSD and safety in the home. As no individual is alike. Everyone is different. What we're going to discuss tonight is highly stigmatized. We're aware of that, and we don't want to say that this applies to everyone. So you may not have experienced safety issues of safety in the home, and that's for the better. And if you're there, it's a form of education and prevention. And congratulations for being here tonight. That's great. Um, no one is alike, so everyone's different. And if that doesn't concern you, or different issues are of areas of concern to you, let us know, and we'll be able to respond during the discussion at the end. So, with that forward, let's jump in. So, FSD is a tricky disability. So prior to joining Health Nexus, I've been working as an independent facilitator. I've been working as well as a FSD coordinator and a worker for a brief amount of time. And I've worked with families and individuals, and I've seen violence in the home. And it's something that we don't want to talk about because we have this sort of conception of violence as something that is not in the family, or when it happens, we minimize it, or we ignore it, or we feel guilty or ashamed of it. And there's no need for that, because it's something that occurs in a lot of homes, and not talking about it only makes it worse. So by finding time like tonight to just put words on feelings and events is the very first step to moving forward and being able to breathe a little bit and say, well, I've experienced days that I didn't feel great, and it was I feared at that moment, and that's okay to acknowledge that as well. And there's no there is no shame in that, in saying that. So, Rebecca, is there something you want to mention as well?
I do appreciate that a lot of people have been living in silence for a long time. And in fact, in Canada, we haven't really had even the language to describe what's been going on in homes. So it's only been the last year that I've been aware of a number of initiatives that have been led a lot by Adopt for Life, but other communities that have come together to try and help support families in understanding what's going on and putting names to what the phenomena is, which allows us then to dig further into the dynamics and what's happening.
And I think it's important as well to mention that it's more common than we think, and because we don't label it or name it as such doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So as much as there is violence against spouses, there is violence against children. We're not denying that. We're just saying that sometimes acts of violence can be directed toward family members, parents, caregivers, siblings, grandparents, and even pets. And it's about everyone being safe. So that's a really important message we want to say tonight, is that safety is for everyone, and that includes people who care about others. And with that, without further ado, we're going to start our discussion tonight. So we want to say first a disclaimer that any time there is harm to a child involved or suspicion of, there is duty to report. So whenever you're discussing issues of safety in the home, be mindful of the language that you use to describe, because without context, people might misunderstand what you're sharing. And everyone must report to Children Protection Services, not only service providers. So if you share that there's a harm or suspicion of a harm, and you're misspeaking, like the frustrations or the fear or the situations that happened, people have a duty to report, and that's the law. So be cautious about the language that you use, and whenever there's a suspicion, whenever there's a doubt that some children are in danger, the right thing to do is call Children Protection Services, so CAS. The goal is to anticipate violence and to prevent it. So Prevention, is the first step. There's no silver bullet. Hopefully, by being more aware, more educated, more equipped, violence in the home will be reduced. And that's the very first thing to acknowledge, is that it's not going to go away, or if it happened, it might reoccur again, it might happen again, and that's okay. It's just about the way that we respond to these situations in more humane and safer ways. And we need to be kind on ourselves. It takes a village to raise a child. It's not easy to do, and with children with special needs, it's even more so the case, because there's less and less support available, and accommodations. And with COVID, we know that it's been much more difficult. So I see Rebecca nodding, eh? So
Well, yes, and I think that one of the things that people get stuck on is they think that if they're going to plan for something, somehow that jinxes it, and that these things are going to happen. But by making a plan to do something doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It means you're going to be prepared if it does. Just like you might take an umbrella in case it rains. It didn't rain because you brought the umbrella.
Yep, that's a good point. So be ready in case it happens. It might not happen. We hope not, but if that's the case, better be prepared, eh? So you want to be able to anticipate situation, not to foresee everything that could happen, eh? There's no way that we can anticipate the worst, but we want to know what we can do. Were there certain situations that are likely to happen? And with FASD, we know that there's a few challenges that are recurring because of the nature of the disability. So impulsivity is an issue. This maturity is another one. Those are difficulties in daily living that may lead to the kind of unforeseen situations that in other families you may not see as often, but in a family with someone with a disability, you may think, that's an area of vulnerability. It's something that we need to be cautious so that everyone keeps safe. So, if there's a situation of violence in your home, you want to be ready. You want to be able to name it as such. And you need to be able to use the language, this is a violent act, or this is a violent behavior, and you shouldn't be ashamed of labeling that behavior as such. And you shouldn't feel guilty thinking, oh, I failed my child, or I'm a bad parent. It's not the issue here. It's about finding ways to really respond to unmet needs. Often challenging behaviors are a result of these unmet needs, and it's sensory issues, it's hunger, sleep deprivation. We know, for instance, that people with FASD have a very fragmented sleep cycle. So imagine, like you're really cranky because you slept 1 or 2 hours a night. You didn't eat enough. You're cold, or your clothes are hurting you. It's all these things that build up until there's a situation where someone lashes out. And it's thinking about all these things, not just whose fault it is, but the overall situation. And again, the goal is to keep everyone safe, and that's the reason why we have these conversations tonight. uh, and it's a good reason. It's not because we want to blame children or parents. It's because we want to make sure that no one is harmed. So there's a couple of trigger signs, and uh, I had a class once. I thought, I often teach classes with children with disability and youth and young adults, and in one of the classes, one individual was very disturbing and had challenging behavior and was abusive to other students and was eventually expelled. The issue was that he was drinking a 2 liter of Pepsi in the classroom and was eating a jar of candies. And, you know, I saw it coming. I said, you shouldn't be drinking all that Pepsi and eating all these candies. And, he was just dysregulated by the end of the class. It was too much. So sometimes we know when something will lead to something, a poor outcome, or an unfavorable situation. And we can prevent these things with a little hindsight. But when it's the first time and you see someone coming in and you see, oh, it's not gonna go well, you may not respond or take action to prevent these behaviors. But with a lot of repetition and like wisdom, you can see the trigger signs coming in. And these are sensory issues or transition, when there's difficult transition to a new place or a new living situation. Confabulation as well, when people think they understood something and they did not, or understood a story differently than how it happened, and they're upset. It's many other things. And again, like basic unmet needs, being tired, hungry, anxious. I'm very cranky when I don't get my coffee. So imagine when your stress level is up the roof because your cortisol reactivity is triggered. We can calm down, but someone with FASD needs more time to calm down. And when you combine all sorts of adverse childhood experiences, and potentially, like post-traumatic events, well, it's normal to be dysregulated, and we wouldn't expect anything else. It's a matter of brain chemistry, and it's a disability. So we need to remember that people don't always control their emotions. So having a diary, to list or remember what are the trigger signs is unpleasant, and it's not something that, most people want to do, but it's a way of moving forward. Because the first time, it's a shock. The second time, the first time actually, I think it's Aristotle that said, the first time is tragedy, the second one is a comedy, so you'll see it coming again and again and again. And if you're equipped, you know right away what to do, and you'll learn some tricks, things that will work or things that may not work, things that may work once and never again. And you'll come better prepared to, by trial and error, to prevent these challenging behaviors to escalating into full-blown violence. By trying to notice these triggers, you'll be safer. Rebecca, do you want to say something? I see you
I was just thinking, it's kind of like being a detective, eh? Like
Yeah.
looking at all the clues and trying to get to know someone better than they know themselves at times, right? And I was just reading Stuart Shanker's book, Self-Regulation. I know he uses an example in there of someone becoming dysregulated at the same time every day, and the parent hadn't noticed until they started just quickly charting it. And it was that pre-sleep, right after dinner time. It was a transition that was just too overwhelming for the individual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyday life detectives, eh? So one more job on your...
Yeah.
So child and parent violence and aggression, I know it's a term that most people don't like. For lack of better words, that's the one we use right now to label a new phenomenon. And, these are terms like sexual violence, or, rape culture, or everything like that, which are words that are very heavily loaded, come to become more acceptable as people use them, and that they normalize them with lived experience and testimony, and that they share, and until it becomes, something that people accept. And we tend to think of children according to Victorian standards, so that they're innocent, and that they're naive, and that they can do no harm. And that's a very Victorian way of thinking. If you go look back in history, people didn't think of children as children until very late in the 19th century, because children would work, so they were little adults. But in our current society, we think of children as someone, or someone who is vulnerable and to be protected. But just like any other human beings, they can have tantrums, they can be dysregulated, they can be hungry or tired, and they can throw a punch. So uh, it's just that when they become adults, teenagers, they become more and more strong. They become stronger, actually, and that's when it's challenging. We know that most of the child and parent violence and aggression happens when they're really young, and then some of it persists during teenage years. But then it becomes a little scary because the child is stronger, and someone who with FASD who's developmentally much younger than their chronological age, their emotion and their regulation tends to come later. So the transition to becoming an adult takes more time, and then the repercussions of that are that you have to tell no, you can't do this or that, and the reaction might be a little extreme. So uh, people will resist the idea that children can be violent, but they can, and that's because of unmet needs. These needs are emotional as well as physical. So it's as much about sleeping and drinking and eating, then it's about feeling safe, having positive attachment to caregivers, and those are the difficult things, especially when you have concurrent diagnosis such as reactive attachment disorder, or ADHD or other comorbidities. So again, I repeat myself, but it's really important to say that the reason why we're doing this today is to keep everyone safe, children, youth, parents and caregivers, and siblings. And I think it's something that has been underscored, under stress. We didn't stress it enough. Sorry. We don't think of the impact of violence in the home on siblings, and they often take a toll by as witnesses, and sometimes as victims of these situations as well. So when caregivers and parents are uh, being silent on child and parent violence and aggression, they also need to consider, other people in themselves. So they might think it's okay for me to be hurt or to be sad, but it's a larger responsibility, and it's doing a disservice to the person to forget or ignore that it happened. It's okay to forgive, but not to ignore. And one way of moving forward the aggression is to practice mindfulness, and we're going to talk more about that today. But really being in the moment and enjoying every moment that there's a positive situation, that there's an attachment that is nurtured. So when things are going well, there's a supper, a dinner, and it's fun. Enjoy it, so that you can hold on to these memories, and they will keep you going, because these are the good moments you want to focus on, not the ones that go very sour. Rebecca, I see you smile.
Just thinking it's almost like you want to have two journals, right? The one where you're documenting the instances that are occurring, and then maybe on that same journal outlining the small joys and the things that are going well, so that you're keeping that balanced.
Yeah. So
more work.
Yeah, again, one more job. So one of the things that caregivers often tell me works the best is de-escalation tips. So mindfulness is one, and de-escalation tips is the other one, because there's a lot of situations that can go either way. It can go, we're going to move on, or it's a big thing. It's a big deal. So learning to self-regulate for the parent or the child by breathing or counting, numbers in your head, or sheeps, one sheep, two sheep, three sheep. It's one way of doing it. And the Crime Prevention Institute has a really nice tip sheet. I invite you to browse the website. So shout out to them. First one, be empathetic and non-judgmental. It's easy to have an opinion on the behaviors, and by just trying to understand and meet people where they're at, it's going to come a long way. We respect personal space. So sometimes, as parents, we want to clean our child's room. We want to, tell them to do things a certain way. And if we're in their bubbles, they need their bubble as well as ours. And having boundaries about personal space in the home, bedrooms, things like that, it's a good practice. Use non-threatening non-verbals. So, with people with FASD, sometimes they're going to match affect. So it's part of the neurological disability piece. It's that if you smile, they're going to smile. If you shout, they're going to shout. So if you're going to get the exact opposite reaction. So by matching you use the affect that you want them to match. And if, for instance, there's something really bad happening and you start crying, it's going to become a very sad situation. But if you remain calm, and it's not easy to do, I agree, that's going to keep it a calm situation. So avoid overreacting. It's not easy to do. I'd say, you can scream, but scream outside, in a paper bag, or, later, or in a different room. And, finding ways to take that, pressure off, but not in the situation where you want an intervention to be applied or used. And you want to focus on feelings, and it's okay to name your feelings. Like, what you're doing, it makes me really sad. You can say things like that. And it helps to, one of the issues that is at stake is the theory of the mind. It's kind of the new theory right now. People say you need to be able to mentalize other people's reaction and see what are the consequences. And we know that people with FSD, they struggle with any consequence-based reasoning, because that connection between cause and action and cause and consequence, is difficult for them. So, by making these links explicit, all the better. Ignore challenging questions. So, if the person is feeling like they don't understand, or they don't have the answer, or they will look bad, they might act bad to dissimulate the fact that they're ashamed of not knowing, or what to do or what to answer. So sometimes, it's better to focus on the behavior that you want and state that behavior than confront people with what happened. Set limits. So it's important. Boundaries are good. People with FSD are very concrete. They like things to be clear and explicit. So these limits are good. They're not harsh. They're enabling everyone to be respecting them. Choose wisely upon what you insist. So, that one's hard. I know that some people want, the groceries to be done, and then dishes to be done, and then cleaning the bedroom, and then being at that appointment for soccer match. You can't do it all. So you got to let go of things. And with people with FSD, it's better to have fewer things, but have success with them. And then you'll be sure, and if there are things that you want to fight for, like, stick with them and don't bulge. But make sure that, you focus on what is really important for you. And sometimes it's, we got to let go of things. So by being too obstinate on certain things, if it's the dishes were not, it's better to, have a dirty house than a house with violence in it, because the plates were thrown out of the window. Sometimes, better a dirty dish on a table than a clean plate but through the window. So allow silence for reflection. it's okay to let people time to process information. People with FSD often need more time to compute information, and that's okay. So don't fill in the silence. Don't state everything that needs to be done. Like, let people go at their own pace, and that will probably improve uh, things and allow time for decisions as well. So don't rush people into doing the things that need to be done or the things that you want them to be done. Sometimes just giving some time will lead to the outcomes that you want. Again, Rebecca, I see you smile.
Yeah, you've got my mind racing. We've actually been talking a lot about de-escalating in our community because it's a really tangible thing, right? So there's the verbal de-escalating, and then there's also the physical component. And we've discovered that there's actually quite a number of organizations that offer this kind of training. Usually the physical part is in person, but there are some that are offering it online. So I've just recently been in dialogue with some of those organizations, and we've also been reviewing a little bit about how people like Dan Hughes, their approach regarding PACE, like playfulness, acceptance, curiosity. What's the E stand for? Empathy. Little like resources that maybe people aren't aware of that are there. And so I don't know what's the best way to be in touch, but there's so many really good resources that can empower a parent to be able to know what they're doing in those moments because they've given it thought ahead of time and had some time to practice.
Yep. And it's often as a tangent, like think about other situations where people were empowered in, resisting systemic violence or harassment. For cat killing, on the streets, people learn martial art, but what really made the difference was being able to stop people for doing that on the street. And you didn't need to get to the point where you would throw a punch back if someone was grabbing you, because you would interrupt that microaggression right away before it led to that point where you were sexually harassed on the street. So, we've seen that with other forms of violence as well. So it's important to get everyone on board. Maybe that's a good segue to say, if some people are not on the same page and they are in denial, or they legitimize some of the aggression in the home, it's unlikely that it's going to change. So we see a pattern that the violence is gendered, and it's gendered usually. Again, I don't want to say it's always like that, but it tends to be from son to woman to female caregivers. So it's a gendered form of violence, and it may be because it's unreported in other ways, or it's not labeled as violence, but we know that it's the most common form. And if the fathers, if the siblings don't learn how to de-escalate, sometimes they're the spark and the person with the FASD is the fuel. So it's not their fault. It's just an inflammable situation. And it's important that everyone do their part and learn. And that means, partly being at webinars like tonight, that the whole family knows what to do, not only, mothers or female caregivers or other people who identify as a woman. So it's really about everyone playing a role in order to work as a team. And for that, it needs to be moments where everyone sits around the table and they discuss it. And there's rules in place, a plan, a vocabulary, and that everyone agrees when things are going well on what to do when things are going wrong. So having a quiet moment, a planned moment to discuss this as a family, and it needs not to be only once, it needs several times so that people agree on what to do were that to escalate, is really helpful. And that's the prevention piece that we talk about. So it's about self-regulation, and if other people are picking on each other, like it's a part of the group dynamics. It's people need to reflect on their own behavior, and it's not who's to blame. It's about how, as a group, as a family unit, dynamics can be improved and bettered. So, it needs not to happen only around the dinner table. It can happen in psychotherapy. It can happen during a support group. It can be a discussion, with service providers who address different members of the family one after the other, or hopefully all together. It's always better than people are in the same room, so there's not a miscommunication between them. Rebecca, I see you again nodding. So, no.
Okay. We're going to get into it more.
So equip family members with, tricks, ways to regulate. And also, there's a lot of tools that are, material tools, not only people, but also, locks, phones, camera, movement detectors, that's things that we don't think about, but having a smart home, really helps. So if you have locks on the door, it's good to put them in front of each sibling's door, but they'll probably be broken, but you want to have them in place. You want to have a phone with a Find My iPhone app, so that if someone flees or is lost, you can find them. You want to prevent situations that you will not have anything to do. So, hiding knives away, out of sight, out of mind. I knew of a family who the daughter had a bunk bed to hide so that the focus person couldn't see her if he was dysregulated. Sometimes it's having, a door with specific set of keys to buy time for the person to cool down and walk away, walking away of the house. Um, it's not a big thing. It's just finding ways to let people calm down so that you're safe while they get regulated. And again, safety always comes first before anything else. So people may be reluctant to having doors, locks on doors, or having certain measures to put in place. But the reason why we do these things is for safety, and that's the first concern. So same with iPads and access to internet. If there's parental filters, or if the screens are in the living room, there's a reason. It's for safety, and that's the main concern before other concerns such as intimacy or um, entertainment. So there's a safety plan that we've designed at Health Nexus. I invite you to go look at it, and we're going to post it in the chat room as well, and we're going to send you the link. It's really simple. It's 2 pages. I invite you to consider filling one with a service provider, so either a FASD worker or a member of an agency that you work with, whether you have some coordinated service planner, or psychotherapist, or social worker. So it's a safety plan to know what to do and when to involve the police. And I've designed a few with families that I've worked with. We wrote one custom before that one was created. And the key about these things is that everyone is on board, including the person with the disability, so that they agree with the plan, and it's not a surprise when it happens. It's not pleasant to call the police, but when that happens, people are not gonna get mad. They just need help. So I know of a family, for instance, they felt bad because they called the police quite often, but never was the son angry for calling the police. He was angry at other things, but not getting the police officer helping him to calm down. So it's the kind of things that we think that it's a bad thing, but it's not. And again, to make sure that it's a positive intervention and not a traumatizing one, the police officer needs to know what to do, what to say, so that there's a script and that things follow the script rather than uh, situation going out of control. So, yep, Rebecca.
I was just going to say, I mean, at Adopt for Life, I can't endorse any safety plan just for liability reasons. But I think that, this is a critical part of what we do in terms of planning, right? What we were talking about earlier. And as you said, when you're consulting with someone, one of the things we can do is encourage parents to make sure that the person they're working with will answer certain questions, right? So some people walk away from safety planning with one plan, which is call 911. And that doesn't work for everybody. They need to know some of the nuances, like how does my child look when they're starting to get upset and starting to get escalated? What does my child need when they're angry? Do they need sympathy and softness, or do they need some parameters and guidelines? And those sorts of things can be written into a safety plan. Those are things that parents can be asking for help with. Also things like the locks on the doors, you mentioned that can work really well for some situations. It can also be dangerous in other situations. So working through, perhaps, some people have a piece of tape with a key hidden somewhere on the door frame. So it's locked, but it's not locked to the other adults who know where the key is. And in that room, there's a phone, some money, a number to an Uber or a taxi to bring, let's say, a friend that's able to, as soon as they walk in the door, that friend helps everything escalate right back down. And that's part of the safety plan. But it's the working it through for the individual. I think that's so important.
That's the difficult piece. It's the compliance into the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So there's a couple of ways that we think about safety and we plan for safety. It means different things. It's not only physical, emotional safety. Sometimes it's internet safety. People with FASD are highly vulnerable because they want to make friends. They're impulsive. So if someone says, come over and leave your parents behind and move in with me, and they've never met that person, they're going to move away, travel a state, and get on a train, and then they'll get married in a week. So not always the case, but I've heard one story that was the case. So the point is to be able to use tracking software or monitor online activities so that if there are interactions online, it's supervised and that what's coming. So you don't want people to be preying online, and there's a lot of online predators for all sorts of reasons, one of them being human trafficking. And that's a recent trend in Ottawa. We're kind of a hub for human trafficking. It's one of the places where there's a lot of traffickers because it's a segue to other provinces between Quebec and Manitoba and Alberta. And we know that there's a real concern about that here in Ottawa. So we want to make sure that we're aware of that. The pattern is always some sort of like alienation of the youth from the family, and they try to boost their self-esteem to recruit them, but against someone else. So they're going to complain about the parents. They're going to say that they're not cool or bad, and they will try to polarize people, and that leads to some sort of like challenging situations where parents are trying to protect their youth, their teenagers, and then by saying no, tension escalates. No, you can't meet that person you just met. No, you can't take the car and go away for 2 weeks, and those situations are difficult, and they are the ones leading to potential escalation. So again, it's the key is prevention, because when that happens, oftentimes, there's little ways to intervene positively. There's people have rights. There's only so much one can do, so preventing these situations is key uh, to um, to stop human trafficking. I've mentioned talking to police earlier tonight. Having the right language. One of the things that caregivers always say to me, it's um, knowing how to speak to police officers, because they might come in, and if they don't have context, they don't. So they don't know what's happening. They just see someone dysregulated. So it's important to say, I need your help, but also do no harm. Please help this person to calm down. They have a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Police officers are getting more and more trained, but education is always a good way to help them de-escalate situations. And mentioning that the individual is dysregulated, near clear, concrete language. So if the officer said, "Don't do that," like it's not helping. Move here, please. That's more helpful. Lower your tone of voice. That's helpful. Don't shout. Not helpful. So it's those kind of things. And I've heard of a colleague of mine who worked preventively with a police officer because he knew it was a matter of time before the youth would be offending, and that they were very, very vulnerable, and that they would be involved either as a victim or as a perpetrator of violence. And uh, they just called the police officer. It was in a rural area, and they said, come in, check in. And they came in when uh, they had time, and that was actually a really cool thing, because the youth was identifying with the cop, was thinking that they were cool. They were kind of a role model. So when they came, because the youth was dysregulated and there was a challenging situation in the home, he was actually excited to see the police officer. So you don't want them to be excited and create violence to see police officers, but you want the intervention to be what it is, an intervention and not traumatic event. So I want to give a shout out to Waterloo, because they have really neat identification card. Individuals can have them in their pockets. You can give them to police officers to educate them. You can, when you call 911, you can give that card as well. And it's really, stating the basics so that people have the context that they need to be able to respond to the situation. Another way to do that is the Medical FASD registry. So it was created by Jamie Dunlap for his autistic son, and they decided to open it and widely to FASD. So that's one way to do it as well. And again, it's about providing the context that people need to better manage the difficult situations. So breaking the stigma, it's important. It's okay to have coffee with friends and other caregivers and share how you feel. We think that support groups are hugely important, because peer support is, one of the best way to move forward. At Health Nexus, we have 49 support groups for people with caregivers and individuals with FASD. So I invite you to join the one in your region. You may contact your FASD worker as well to know more about that, or send us an email at Health Nexus. There's also the support groups with Adapt for Life, Rebecca.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we do.
So it's for adoptive parents. And oftentimes, we see the same families. So there's a lot of overlaps. And doing that, meeting with someone else and talking about it, you'll realize that you're not alone. You're not whining or complaining. You're just sharing your experience in order to find strategies that are going to make it better, and hopefully, acknowledge the feelings and also the situations that you're in. So it's challenging for caregivers and siblings, and putting words on feelings and bruises, it's able to move forward. And I've used the word bruises, but we've seen all sorts of situations. People with it's not only tantrum. Sometimes it's very intense, and we know it's broken bones and it's threats. And actually, studies in the UK say the most common form of violence and aggression is against a person, and then it's going to be criminal damage against property, and then after that, some sort of theft or handling. So that's the most uh, reoccurring challenging behaviors that we see in the home. And there's also the kind of mind games that are going on. Those are more rare, but that's because they're not reported to police officers, but they're happening on a daily basis. They're controlling behavior or coercive behavior. So it's about like making others dependent of them, or limiting their liberty, or humiliating them or injuring them. So it's that kind of behavior on a it's psychological violence as well. So it's all sorts of violence, and it's about how it feels to be in the home, and it's not great. So when experiencing that, it's okay to get professionals involved. So the police, child protection services, FSD workers, or social workers. People are not always comfortable calling the police or CAS, even though their role is preventive as well as intervening. And I've worked with people with CS. They want to help. It's not that they want to take children away from homes. That's the opposite of what they want. So it's actually far from their mission, and the way that the whole organization operates. But they need context to do good work, and they need to understand the situation. So they're going to use judgment, but they work with the information that you give them.
And if people are hesitant, I mean, some people are for very good reasons to involve authorities, depending so many circumstances. And in today's day and age, we're talking a lot more about whether or not it's always safe for someone to call the police. I think that's why your piece around social networks and groups is really important, because it needs to be talked about somewhere. You need to start somewhere to keep it outside of the secrecy and the shame in the home. And so if you have a support group, or Adopt for Life has a group, that you're able to start to talk with people who understand on the same level as you, what's going on into the home, you can start to identify which things you need more help in, and which things you've taken on for yourself, because there's a lot of parent blaming in many circles, and you need to find those safe places where you're not being blamed for what's going on, but empowered to make whatever changes that you're able to make.
Yeah, and sometimes you may be really transparent and honest and share with people, and then you're going to get unsolicited advice, and that's not helping. So it's about finding people that understand and support you, and peer support is often a good way to start. I have a case study I want to go through, just because it's easy to think about concrete situations, to see concrete things, concrete strategies that can be used. So let's think about Jonathan, for instance, 10 years old, screaming. Mary asks him to get dressed to see the doctor. Jonathan is on the verge of crying and blocks the door. He has bitten Mary last week and throws objects at her when he is mad. So, pretty young, but that's pretty clear violence, So biting, throwing objects. So what can be done? The first thing is to think about, how can Jonathan calm down? So there's an unmet need somewhere, some issue that needs to be addressed. And before we get to that, we just need to take some pressure off. So Mary can reassess, does Jonathan need to go to his medical appointment? Is that really important? Is that a cold, or is that a DSO assessment? So did it take 2 years to schedule, or it's something that can be done tomorrow? I have a caregiver that would always tell me, like these appointments would be difficult because she would have to balance between, financial and time planning and safety. So, weighing the for and against. Is it more important to threaten, one's safety to get that piece moving forward, or you can let it go? And most often, you let it go. So, um, then inviting Jonathan to sit down, not insisting that he goes outside and pushing him through the door, like if he doesn't want to go, give him some time to reflect on his action. And then maybe it's a simple, sensory issues like such as like he doesn't like his jacket because it's this texture or the textile. Maybe he's hungry or tired. He needs an apple before going outside. Maybe he's just traumatized by doctors that he's seen and he associate that with a really bad experience and he has some sort of PTSD. Uh, Maybe he's not so much defiant but struggling with something. Sometimes we think of difficult children as having defiant obsessive defiant disorder. What's the word again? Defiant behavior. And it's not so much about intentions. I think that's the shift that we want to bring forward. It's not about what people want so much as what hasn't been put in place or what is blocking the way forward to um, the situation that you want. So shifting from want to can't, and then from can't to can. So it's being able to understand, like, is that a lack of social adaptive skills to express himself? Maybe he want to say, I have some deep fear of meeting with that professional that will assess me because he will figure out that I'm not normal, and this creates anxiety for me. Anxiety is often the root of these challenging behaviors. But saying that requires some sort of maturity, verbal skills, as well as like introspection. And when you have a disability, it's kind of hard to, and even for an adult, I'd say not most people are not honest with themselves about how they feel. So maybe it's not that. Maybe he's just dysregulated because of sensory issues. Maybe it's medication that he needs. Uh, Maybe it's just the cortisol level that's up the roof because of something that happened prior to that. Uh, by listening to Jonathan and practicing mindfulness techniques and putting a combination into place, it can be improved. So, giving Jonathan some time to calm down. And then when things are better, then you suggest again, are you ready now to go see the doctor? Sure, yes, I am. So it's as simple as that. But if you insist, if you put the coat on Jonathan, if you scream at the child to go and to listen, it's not going to get better. So it seems obvious, but in the moment, it's very difficult to have some sort of critical distance. And by uh, having a little experience, it becomes easy to recognize that maybe doctors are a trigger sign. Maybe it's that jacket that's the issue, and you'll figure out what works or what doesn't work. So use positive reinforcement, avoid consequences, favor predictable, immediate parental response. So, if you hold a grudge, it's not going to be useful. The individual with FASD will have forgotten what the issue is. It's a different day. Each day is fresh and starts anew. So that's a strength. And praise, people with FASD, they need praise and, self-esteem to be reinforced. So you want to encourage things when it goes well, celebrate a day that had no aggression, and say that was a really nice day. I really enjoyed your company today. And, over time, it scaffolds. So that's one thing that's important to say. And role playing, practice makes perfect. And, stating the behavior that you wish to see is really helpful. Repeat, be concrete. If you're familiar with 8 magic keys or alarm, those are tools you can use. Use social stories that like them. People with FASD, they might see it coming, that this is a story about aggression and violence. But, it's psychotherapists that I've talked to say that it's useful because they walk through them and they don't feel confronted. So they will be able to voice how they feel with the story, using the story to put uh, a, a label on the situation that they felt. So even though you think oh he or she's gonna see me coming with that one, it's a way for people to express themselves and open up. And these social stories, I find they're really useful. People with autism, they use pictograms or some sort of decision making trees. I like social stories for that, and role playing as well. And modeling is the new way to teach things. So you want to help people move toward the steps, and you want to provide them with roles, with scripts, with examples of things that work, rather than expecting them to come up with these on their own. So and finally, practicing mindfulness. So for caregivers, I have a list of 10 things, and then we're going to move on to discussions. That's kind of the closure of today's webinar. Take a break, focus on the present, take one step at a time, laugh and be positive, praise resilience, celebrate resilience, practice gratitude, be thankful for what you have, create a sanctuary, a place where you feel at peace and safe, be kind to yourself and forgive yourself if you lost your temper. It's okay too. No one's perfect. And that's all for today. And I would really encourage you to use the chat to ask us a few questions so Rebecca and I can elaborate on what you want to know. Any question, anyone?
No
Okay.
questions so far, but we've got lots of time. So I'm hoping that people will put some questions in, and Rebecca is all ready to moderate them.
So what we're going to do meanwhile, Rebecca and I will have a discussion. So tell me, Rebecca, when did you first hear of child and parent violence and aggression in your practice?
We really started, I think, a couple of years ago. We started to hear about it a lot more from the UK. Some of our friends and resources over there received some grants and some money to do some research and to provide some support. So we've been, but as you know, we've been hearing about the actual phenomena since the beginning of time. This is not something new that's happening. It's just something that's recently been identified as with having a name and having a reason to help support parents and children so that everyone is feeling happy. I think the problem is we forget that children are not happy as well when they're exhibiting this behavior. And so, changing family dynamics and working to support this has been part of it all along. We just haven't identified it as a...
I remember one of the client that I was working with, the family were fine, and they were talking about all sorts of challenges until one day things went too far that they couldn't keep it a secret anymore. And a door has been broken, and walls have been punched. And I've seen rooms. I would go to visit youth and teenagers in their... I would always ask when I was doing home visit, can I see your bedroom? I'm curious to see where you live. And I would see bedrooms that would be destroyed. So holes in the walls, and curtains being teared up, and things, chairs broken on the floor and things like that. And I knew that was kind of a space, of chaos, controlled chaos, and then the rest of the house would be nice. But then that was a sign that something was happening, and then you hear nothing until things go too far, and then you realize that people that you've worked with or that you've seen for years have been silent. And there was a caregiver, I think 2 months ago, told me, I've known that person for 5 years, told me 2 months ago, and by the way, I've been struggling with violence in my home for like 25 plus years. And it's the kind of things that even though you think you know
Fear
someone,
of sharing that, right? The stigma.
you think you know someone. That's a very good friend of mine. Someone I had bottles of wine with. Worked with for a couple of years. But then she didn't feel like she would share it with me.
And maybe that's leading us to this person's question here is they're asking, how can caregivers deal with people that may not understand or be supportive? And do you have suggestions? Perhaps that's an example right there that you just sharing. Simply opening up the conversation is sometimes scary because you don't know what kind of resistance you're going to get. But if you start to share stories of other people, people might be more willing to share. But what about the suggestions around how to interact with people who don't understand when you are rejected or blamed or in a non-supportive environment?
I feel like, and please correct me, Brianna, if I'm not getting your question right, but sometimes you say, okay, that's enough. Like I'm not comfortable with that. This went too far, and the other person say, no, I disagree with you, and then that's how caregivers get a divorce. It's that someone wants to provide care, and the other one wants to cut all ends loose. So that's what I see quite often, and it's just different ways of addressing these situations. And part of it is, the who's the target of the aggression, and part of it is also, how people are supportive of each other.
And one thing that some of our families have been working on is a script for themselves to understand what they need. So we have some parents, one of the catalysts for our committee to start working on this was a parent who is experiencing violence directed towards her from her child. And she has helped us understand that the insight that she had onto what her needs were, we could then ask her, what is it that you need us to say? What is it what support do you need from us? What are you getting that is you're perceiving as resistance or misunderstanding from us? And then she could guide us. And so now parents are starting to write their own script. Like when they're talking to their friend, they're saying, I don't need you to tell me how to find strategies and tips and tools. What I need you to do right now is tell me how horrible of a situation I'm in and cry with me. That's what I need.
Not doing anything sometimes is the best thing to do. So, and it makes me think, just this weekend, I was helping my sister to get a divorce and leave her abusive husband. And she has 2 young children. And when she said to my mother, like, I think he's abusive. My mom said, you're not easy to live with, you're difficult yourself, and that's the kind of blaming that people who don't understand, who don't see violence on everyday life, they'll try to protect the children, and she said to my sister, don't get a divorce, it's bad for the children, but that's just doing a disservice. And instead, my sister needed to explain, this is how it feels, this is the kind of things that I've been living with, and sharing these things, it's difficult,
I think you're right there. I think the very first thing we need is to have somebody that listens without any judgment. That's a really important piece. And I think service providers are so keen to fix and want to jump in with a solution. And often it is just the listening ear that is the very first piece that is needed.
Yeah.
We have a question in the... So my son has diagnosis of FASD as well as severe intellectual disability. So many of the mindfulness, social story modeling suggestions are beyond my son's capabilities. He's 11 and becoming more sexually aggressive to my daughter and children much younger than he is. and becomes violent when he is told no. Do you have any suggestions to keep my daughter and other children safe, as well as when my son becomes aggressive when he is not allowed to make sexual advances? I just want to let you know that I'm actually doing next week a session for caregivers for the Niagara support group on challenging sexual behaviors, and one for youth and young adult stories with FASD. So I'm doing that next week. So please register if you can. I have a couple of things to say here, and I could go on for at least half an hour. So, Rebecca, do you want to have the first word?
No, I'll listen.
So, there's, I was talking about modeling, and theory of the mind, and a piece of FSD is learning how to understand how the other person feels. It takes time to process, so sometimes there's a delay and it comes much later. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it takes time before that processing takes place. And we see with children with FASD, exhibiting early puberty, age of 8, 9, 10, 11, sometimes younger even then. Their body is changing faster than others. And with this maturity piece, they're not necessarily bounding with people their age. They're relating to people who have interactions that suit their developmental age. So a piece of that is, curiosity. So, in the stages of sexual exploration, there's curiosity first, then relationships, and then eventually sexual rapport. So it's tricky when you're not going through those phases and you're skipping right to the sexual behavior. So providing sexually appropriate education is one piece. Another piece is prevention and avoiding, situations where he will be alone with your daughter, say. So supervision is a really important piece. Often, early inappropriate sexual behaviors are related to in immediate gratification. So it's a sensory issue. So an OT can help with that. As well, it's about understanding, what's the public versus private boundaries. So what can be done in my room, or what's my stuff? These are very abstract concepts, property, or limits. So it's easier to state the behavior that you want. And I know most people are not comfortable with that, but harm reduction. So by stating the behavior that you want, you're enabling your son to have the sexual gratification that he wants in an appropriate setting. So if he is touching himself, you want to teach him to do it in his bedroom alone. And it's those kind of things. But then again, it's very tricky because there's very limited resources in the schools. Among service providers, there's liability issues, there's a confabulation piece. People are not comfortable talking about sexuality. But you can definitely get people involved. And there's a great website calling Teaching Sexual Health, Teaching Sexual something something. I'll find it. I'll bring it next week or post it later in the chat. And that's the kind of resources that you can use. So, there are other options, but then it requires to involve some clinicians and having a psychotherapist, to do developmental dyadic psychotherapy will help so that he understands, and think about your siblings as well, so your daughters might be experiencing some sort of like trauma or stress, and you want to make sure that you're thinking about them as well, not only about your son or yourself. So it's really tricky. Hopefully this is providing a few solutions. So I don't want to go too much into the specific of sexual violence, but that's one piece there. I don't know if that's helpful or useful, so I hope it is. and there's medications as well, that can be looked into if there's worse behaviors.
I think about our friends in the UK. People like Yvonne Newbold have the website with a lot of resources and tips around those sorts of things as well.
So while we're waiting for another question, I would just want to say, what's the most inspiring story that you've heard, Rebecca?
Oh, golly,
Is there someone that that things became better?
That's the story that everybody wants to hear, right? And everybody wants to know that that's going to happen to them. I think my most inspiring stories are when parents develop their resiliency and their connectivity, that they're able to weather the storms that come their way. But some of the little things that we've been celebrating are some of the things, like I had a parent the other day say, instead of arguing and things getting escalated in person, they instituted cell phones or walkie-talkies. So when things started to get escalated, they would just take their devices into separate rooms, so it couldn't get physical. And often with the removal of that in-person contact, they were able to work it through a lot better. So those sorts of things I find very inspiring.
I have a family I knew. The son was really going through a lot of things, and it was a concern for the safety. And he had a daughter, and I spoke to her, and she said, "You know what? I didn't like him when he came in our house, and he's grown to be the best brother I ever had." And she had many others, and sometimes you hear those stories where people learn to accept others with their strengths and their flaws, and they just care for each other in a way that they weather the storm, like you said. And it's not gonna mean that there's not gonna be bad days again, but that it's gonna be something that they're gonna survive together.
Yeah, that there's been some sort of repair to the relationship, right? That the relationship can continue. It doesn't have to stay severed from the event.
Yep. So, for instance, that little girl, the brother who would only play video games and during the night and sleep the whole day, would wake up and then walk her to school and bring her backpack. It's those kind of heartwarming things that he would do things the day before, but then he would wake up and then bring the backpack. So it's those kind of things, those little heartwarming moments that we need to celebrate and be thankful for. So we have 10 more minutes. If you don't have any question, I just want to reiterate once more, it's really helpful to connect with peers, to talk to your FASD worker, to talk to your support group, other parents, people that understand. One of the issue that we keep seeing with child and parent violence and aggression and safety in the home is that there's little research, and then people say, well, it's less prevalent than other forms of violence, but there's no study about it. So they might be surveys, but people are not going to take them, or they're not going to answer because they're worried about whether or not that information will leak, or whether action will be taken. And that speaks really into the importance of sharing stories and creating safe space like tonight for that discussion to blossom and lead to people gaining self-confidence in sharing their stories, and really moving the discussion forward to from blame and stigma to strategies and resilience instead. And again, everyone are experiencing different situations. There is no silver bullet. I just want to say again, some individuals with FASD may never be violent, and some parents may never experience, violence in their home. Some people with FASD may never have adverse childhood experience. or get involved with the criminal system, and that's great. The goal of having this webinar tonight is to prevent these situations and be able to be better equipped if that were to occur. So, well,
someone's just saying thank you for sharing this information and these tools.
Thank you for you guys being there tonight, because we're doing this for you, not for us. So Mary says, I live in fear daily and wonder what or how to deal with that. That's a difficult one, eh? Thank you for sharing that, Mary. Do you wanna answer that one, Rebecca?
Well, I think that the reaching out and finding that safe place to begin. Don't stop sharing your story until you find someone that will listen and believe you and start to provide you with the support you need.
And just know that you're not alone, for sure. So it helps to move forward when you know that what you're living is real and that you're not alone experiencing that.
That fear is telling you something.
And it's there's the fear, there's the feelings that you control, but it's not up to you to make it better by yourself either, eh? So it's about involving everyone. And the first step for that, is addressing the situation. So I think it's important to restate, by ignoring behaviors, it's gonna happen again and again and again. And what we see is that sometimes intervention by the police, or like some sort of very sad outcome, like some sort of intervention that leads to criminal charges, sometimes is what's necessary for the safety of everyone. So sometimes, it's unfortunate, but safety comes first. And thank you for sharing that again. I appreciate that we reached out to someone and that we were able to speak to what you live.
Yes, thank you indeed, Pascal, and thank you, Rebecca, for sharing everything. And just one little word there. If someone is really in fear of and things escalate, you can always call the police too. There's no shame in doing that, right?
Yep.
So if that's the necessary piece, then that is what to do. I think you mentioned that in your situation. Of course, there's things we can try and put in place, but there is sometimes situations just get to that where that has to happen.
And there's a lot of crisis lines that exist as well, you can reach out to. So sometimes talking to someone who may be able to, intervene, whether that's providing funds for respite, or, some sort of program for, managing the behaviors. It's not always things that we know that can help and make a difference. But by talking to someone else, these options become available.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you make me think about, I was talking to a family not too long ago who had, I think they said there were 3 calls going on in the house at the same time. The mother had given the kid's help phone number to the child to have the child call, saying, I don't know how to control myself, I'm going crazy. And then someone else, I think it was a sibling, was on with another call to a professional that was already in their circle and preventative, and the mom was on a hotline as well. And they just gave it all, right? Like reached out for help. And I don't think they needed to call 911 in the end. I think one of those resources was the one that was able to bring help to them. I just thought, what a resilient person to not give up. everyone was trying to reach out in that moment.
Great. That's a really great story. Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing. Good. And I think with that, we don't have any more questions. Pascal, you were going to say something.
I was going to say that. So thank you, everyone. And on that note, we will end this webinar, and we send you our best wishes, and take care of yourself and be kind to yourself.